Good day. As we continue progressing through the flop era of gaming, it gets increasingly difficult to remember what a good game even is. The golden age of gaming took place between the years 2000 and 2010. Developers had finally mastered their craft, and gaming got more and more complex, but also more and more refined. Today, we are going to have an ultimate awesome retrospective of great justice, and we're going to take a look at every bloody gaming genre imaginable and see why 2000s games were the very best. And we're going to remember why gaming was good in the first place. So let's get started. The first-person shooters of the 2000s began to incorporate much more character into their protagonists, and the stories began to rival movies in terms of narrative complexity. The gameplay got much more fluid, it got much more precise. Gone were the days of simply shooting in the general direction of the enemy, and now you can make pinpoint hits as controls began to be more and more refined in terms of their aiming ability. This was truly the golden age of the FPS genre.
2001 was a watershed year of first-person shooter gaming. This year showed off all the fancy graphical technology that would take gamers from the jagged polygons of the 90s to the photorealism of the future. And nothing exemplifies this more than AVP2. AVP 99 was the game that preceded this one, and it was all 90s jagged polygons, but it was a top-tier game. AVP2 took everything that AVP 99 did and did it better. Now, story had a much greater focus. We had actual character for the Marine, the Predator, and the Xenomorph, and all their characters interacted with one another throughout a fairly complex story. The graphics here, ladies and gentlemen, were nothing short of exceptional back in 2001. We had excellent and highly detailed 3D models, we had large open areas, and we had amazing texture work found throughout. The gameplay for each character that you played was complex but refined, and each new element worked in concert with the other. AVP2 truly gave us a next-gen AVP experience. And then we go to Halo. Halo Combat evolved gaming as we knew it. This game was released in 2001, and it changed the whole bloody game. Literally, this game practically defined the early 2000s. And this was to the 2000s what Doom was to the 90s. This game featured everything that the early 2000s stood for: refinement and evolution. This game was, however, responsible for the hated two-weapon rule of the coming bro era. The AI of the enemies was very complex, with the elites being wily foes. Now, in addition to having massive outdoor areas, we could now traverse those areas with vehicles, and the driving controls made sense and were fun to use. The narrative in this game blew everything that was released in 2001 out of the bloody water. You now had cinema-grade cutscenes and a new IP that gave us an amazing sci-fi universe with a protagonist that, while a man of few words, had an impact that reverberated through gaming. For the first time, we got an FPS that felt like a true virtual world, and that's not even getting into the multiplayer, and that featured LAN parties that were a big part of this era. For me personally, Halo marked my return to console gaming as my PC was starting to age rather rapidly. I picked up this game in 2003. Essentially, I was given a choice. I could pick a 3030 Winchester 94 or a new game console, and I chose game console since I had not been able to get to the range that much. Me and my grandfather went to a local game shop. We asked around about all the consoles, and the shop dude showed me Halo. After an eternity of waiting, I opened it up on Christmas morning of 2003, and I've been a fan ever since. Now about that PC, you see, back in 2001, I got a new Dell desktop PC, and at that point it was top of the bloody line. Now the first game I took home from Best Buy was Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and man, I wasn't lying when I said gaming advanced quickly in those days. See, as a super young kid, I played Wolfenstein 3D, and that was top of the line, but by my early teens, gaming had advanced to full 3D graphics with advanced AI and level design. In this game here, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, we got all kinds of great weapons, a great supernatural plot, although a bit short of character. This was a game I sunk my teeth into back in 2001, and I still love it to this very day. And what's really cool about Return to Castle Wolfenstein is it actually was packed in with a copy of Wolfenstein 3D, the first of the retro games I would come to play. With World War II in mind, the war shooter genre might be old hat today, but in the early 2000s, it was something fresh and new. Not having a PS1 in the 90s, I never played Medal of Honor, but one day at my Best Buy, I found this game. The blurb on the back sold it, and I threw it into my Dell CD drive and into the world of World War II. Medal of Honor Allied Assault is a first-person historical shooter where you fight through some historical battles on the Western Front. We got all the great World War II weapons, but no M1 Carbine, and the M1 Garand disappears pretty fast too, but whatever. AI that is fun and challenging, and great, huge, open levels with a lot of crap going on them. Sometimes the game gets a bit too hard, but that's nothing a little God mode can't fix. This game walked, so all those great military shooters later in the decade could run. Doom 3, ladies and gentlemen, this is when the shit got real. Doom 3 was like a game from the bloody future, graphics unlike any ever seen. Doom 3 also showcased an epic lighting engine that was beyond next gen, and this was integrated into gameplay, meaning it was very dark and you had to use a flashlight to see the enemies. Now today, people shit on that flashlight, but man, back in the day, it made that game even more creepy to play. The game had a bunch of awesome evolutions of the original Doom guns and monsters, and it kept up Doom's frantic pace and never slowed down. The game was told in both cutscenes and audio logs, and in order to understand what was going on in Doom 3, you had to listen to every bloody one of those logs. And the entire game was immersive as hell. 2004 was a rough year as there are a bunch of great games coming out, and I can only choose a couple, and sadly Doom 3 would have to wait for me to play. Halo 2 was the biggest game of the year in 2004, and I was bloody psyched and hyped for its release. Not only was the super awesome middle edition pre-ordered, I even had and still have the calendar. Sure, it's not April 1st, 2004 now, but who knows what the future may hold. Halo 2 would further push the envelope for first-person shooters. We got amazing cutscenes, top-tier voice work, and tweaked gameplay. And while I love Halo, I have to admit that it ruined first-person shooters. Not only did Halo 1 introduce the two-weapon rule, Halo 2 introduced regenerative health, and these two horsemen would bring about the bro-apocalypse of the 2010s. Despite having regenerative health, the game was still tough to beat, and you better be a Spartan yourself to beat it on Legendary. Halo 2 introduced some new enemies and some new weapons, and both would become legendary. You got the ever rage-inducing brutes that go nuts when you kill all but one of them, and when they go nuts, they can tank a shitload of shots and will definitely make you want to throw the controller out the bloody window. Now, thankfully, to combat these brutish bastards, you've got the iconic BR-55 battle rifle that sends them straight to hell and will be seen in all future Halos. This game added even more awesome characters to the Halo canon. We got Sergeant Johnson and a foil for the legendary Halo Chief, the Arbiter. He would become a pillar of Halo and would give the series even more character. Due to the rushed nature of the game, it didn't have an ending, and I still remember to this very day beating this game just before I had to go to marching band practice, and I was shocked, literally shocked, that the game didn't have a proper bloody conclusion, and thus I would have to wait in anticipation. Sadly today, Star Wars is a kiddie franchise for assholes, but back in the early 2000s, it was anything but. Back in 2005, the prequels were finished, and while they were pretty awkward movies, the EU era they spawned was nothing short of kick-ass. Episode 2 Attack of the Clones might be the worst of the real Star Wars movies, but it did give us the Grand Army of the Republic, and thanks to LucasArts, we got the Republic Commandos. Think clone troopers, but they juice. They're totally natty, bro. These dudes were the Spec Ops of the Star Wars world. In this game, you are RC-1138, aka Boss, as played by Tamora Django Fett Morrison. This game is inspired by the Rainbow Six series of tactical shooters, but streamlined. You control your squad via a couple button presses, and this game is centered around squad control, and it's integrated in a very slick way, and you never just fight by yourself. This is something that should have been the shape of things to come, but alas, it is simply a holy relic of a more civilized age. And speaking of a holy relic of a more civilized age, man, this is the most unsung, slept on classic of all time. Time Splitters Future Perfect was and is one of the most fun and funniest of the first-person shooter genre. This game is more or less to games as Mel Brooks is to movies. It parodies first-person shooters, but laughs with them instead of at them. This game was done by the same people who did GoldenEye, and this is the final state of that line of development. We got great AI for the enemies, extremely fluid and precise controls, and we even get puzzles. And not only do we get that, we have a full multiplayer with bots and a bloody level editor. This was the full bloody package, but sadly it never got the recognition it deserved. Another game that didn't get the recognition it deserved was Area 51. This game was released by the boys at Midway, yeah, the original Mortal Kombat guys. This is a fairly standard for the early 2000s FPS, but it had some special sauce. You can turn into an alien at a certain point in the game. You got some great levels with a lot of cool little nods to original conspiracy theories, a story that is a great send-up of those early conspiracy theories, and we got Fox Mulder himself, David Duchovny, as the main character. We got Marilyn Manson playing as an alien. Despite all that greatness, this is still just a fairly normal game in an era where gaming was extraordinary. Now, software life cycles eventually have an ending, and when the Xbox Original's life cycle ended, I just had to get the new hotness of the Xbox 360 so I could play all the great new games coming out. I saved my pennies, and in 2007, I took the plunge and got a red ring of death right out of the box. A trip back to Target later, and I had a working Xbox 360, and I finally got to play Quake 4, a game I had been lusting after for quite some time. Quake 4 is an evolution of the gameplay scene in Doom 3. We got even more awesome weapons, even more fun enemies, and a great story to boot. You play as a guy named Matthew Kane, a possible great-grandson of John Kane, aka the Doom 3 guy. This game featured the most brutal scene in a game to date. You get captured by the evil Strogg and turned into one of them, and that Stroggification scene was the gold standard for graphical complexity for some time after. Quake 4 showed that FPS games were only gonna get better and better. Now, like with Quake 4, I lusted after this game for some time, and after I got my 360, I picked this little number up. Done by Monolith Productions, the same guys behind AVP2, we got a hell of an FPS game that showed how far AI for enemies had come, with enemies having pretty good tactics, adding great weapons, very photorealistic environments, a super fun slow-mo mechanic, and you had yourself more 2000s gold. Halo 3, like with its predecessor, was an event. Everyone was hyped and psyched for the conclusion to the Halo trilogy, and I was right there with them. 2007's Halo 3 was a major game for me because it was what I considered my first adult game. Not for the content, but well, I was an adult. In February of 2007, I turned 18, and by Halo 3's release, I was out of high school and into college, and I was growing into an adult, and playing Halo 3 just felt different. Halo 3 fixed many of the problems brought about by Halo 2's rush development. We had a hell of a lot more epic story, kick-ass new weapons, and graphics that looked real, and hell, they hold up well today. And the ending is second to none. This game's multiplayer built upon what Halo 2 started and is even more fun than what was seen in Halo 2. The game also shipped with a rudimentary map editor called The Forge, and hell yeah, I spent hours placing junk around and coming up with stories for my basic map editing. I loved placing teleporters around the grav lifts on certain maps to screw with my friends. And this is the Halo game that I played the most multiplayer, and I still remember playing this game for hours and hours with all my cool dudes. Can it run Crysis? That was the question on everyone's lips back in 2007. Well, in 2008, I finally could answer with my brand spanking new gaming PC, and I could play the game on all high at a non-HD screen resolution, but still, this game was graphical insanity. If Halo 3 looked good, this game looked even better. You control a guy named Nomad, and you fight the fell forces of North Korea in the 2020s. Wait, is this a documentary? You got some decent vehicles, all the controls for them are pretty terrible, and speaking of terrible controls, you eventually get to fly a horribly programmed plane. The combat is fun, but the aiming could be a little better, both with the keyboard and mouse and controller. The enemy AI is okay, but a little spotty, and towards the end of the game, it gets a little janky. But despite all that, this showed that even at the end of the early 2000s, devs were still pushing the envelope. Sadly, not everyone appreciated pushing the envelope because everybody hated this game, probably without even playing it. Wolfenstein 2009 had kick-ass gameplay, a fun story, and pretty sexy graphics, but it was 2009 and COD 4 started the bro era of shooters, and everyone assumed that this game was one of those, what with its 2-weapon rule and regenerative health. But look past those and you will find a game that was still in the early 2000s, with wide open levels, great enemy AI, and fun firefights. This was sadly the last of a quickly dying breed. Finally, we come to the end of the 2000s with the most legendary co-op shooter of all time. Hard to imagine that this game is from that long ago. In this game, you and up to 3 friends take on the Horde of the Undead and a bunch of awesome official maps and endless great mod maps. You have great guns, you have great melee weapons, explosives, knives, sharp sticks, no tricks, and over the years I've used it to break the ice when wanting to date a nice girl. If this was the last of the great shooters, then it truly went out with a bang.
The RPG, the role-playing game, is my single favorite gaming genre of all time. Yeah, I talk about first-person shooters a lot, but that's only because the RPG is one of the rarest, most hard-to-develop for genres of all. Why? Because what you're crafting is a virtual world. You gotta have great gameplay, you gotta have great story, and you've got to mesh both together to make an excellent package. The early 2000s had some of the best. Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect, Dragon Age. These were some of the most legendary games of all time.
Knights of the Old Republic. In 03, the only RPG I'd ever played was bloody Pokemon. This game here was something I had never experienced before, and I found I kinda sucked at RPGs. For the first playthrough at least, but by the second, I found my groove as a smooth-talking, high-charisma smuggler. I will never forget that second playthrough. I named my dude Jean-Luc Picard, and I played like I thought Captain Picard would play. Now, everything was easier as I wasn't getting into combat all the time, and I've always played that way since. So what we have here is a third-person turn-based role-playing game, and it has you play as a random dude that goes Jedi and has to save the galaxy from the evil Darth Malak. You amass a party of cool dudes and even fall in love with a bitchy British woman. I practically lived in this game for years as I loved all the side quests and all the player choices. This was gaming on a level I never dreamed possible, and thanks to this game, I got even more invested in Star Wars and started reading the expanded universe. And then there is Knights of the Old Republic 2. Oh shit, ladies and gentlemen, this game was and still is one of my top 5 games of all time. Take everything KOTOR 1 did, make it better, and then make it that much darker. In this game, you play as the Jedi Exile, and it takes place a few years after the end of Knights of the Old Republic 1. You gotta pick up the pieces from that game and save the galaxy. I think. Sadly, this game was rushed and incomplete at launch, but despite that, the characters are what sell it. Everyone, including the player, is broken, and you gotta put them all back together again. I can fix the emo babe! Cause yes, there is an emo babe in this game. This game featured some of the best bloody writing to date and kept me coming back for more year after year. Funny story, I rented this game first and had a game-breaking bug where a character named Mira just dropped dead for no reason. Me mum had bought me the game for Christmas, but alas, despite my great attempts at persuasion, I had to wait until December 25th to finally finish KOTOR, and it was more than worth the wait. I was never really a fantasy guy, but a best friend of mine suggested I give this game a try, and I was not disappointed. Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion is a first-person real-time action RPG where you play as the champion of Cyrodiil, and you have to stop the fell forces of Mehrunes Dagon and close shut the jaws of Oblivion. This was the second Bethesda game I ever played, and man, this was even more immersive than the first one I played. You could pick a direction and find adventure. The game world was massive, and there was always something to do. The gameplay was pretty bloody complex in places, and while janky, that was nothing a few mods couldn't fix. The only weak part of Oblivion was the rather limited story that mods could not really fix. This game, while not as good in the story department as KOTOR, it was still one that I would spend ages in nonetheless. Now, the big problem with Oblivion is this got the ball rolling for DLC. We got DLC content in the guise of horse armor, and this would inspire a lot of unscrupulous companies to start adding cosmetics to their games, thus ensuring that gaming would decline into microtransaction insanity. If I thought KOTOR had been good, I hadn't seen nothing yet. When I heard about Mass Effect, I pre-ordered the game right bloody quick, and I was most assuredly not disappointed. Now we had a third-person real-time combat RPG with fully voiced dialogue for the protagonist? I was dubious at first, but back in 2007, devs actually cared, and thus the player character, Commander Shepard, said what you wanted him or her to say. Graphically, we got a game that still looks pretty bloody amazing to this very day, and the story was even better than KOTOR in some respects. We got a whole new IP that, while it did its own thing, it drew inspiration from a number of top quality sci-fi franchises. This game took everything we saw in KOTOR and brought RPGs to the very next dimension. Sadly, when Mass Effect 2 was released in 2010, EA, the new publishers of Mass Effect, saw what Bethesda had done with its horse armor and decided to cut out whole characters and whole levels of content so you could pay for it after you bought the game. Going back to the good days, in 2008, I had my gaming PC, and one day after beating Mass Effect, I went to my local Target, and I was looking at the PC games, and what did I find? Something called Fallout 3? At that point, I'd never even heard of the Fallout franchise, or Bethesda for that matter, so I decided, what the hell? And then I took my first step into a larger world. Fallout 3 is the continuity reboot of the post-apocalyptic Fallout series. Now, instead of it being top-down, it was first-person, just like Bethesda's Elder Scrolls franchise. Fallout 3 introduced me to an awesome post-apocalyptic world with great characters, great guns, fun gameplay complexity, even though repairing items took way too many resources, and we had a great bloody story with a terrible bloody ending that thankfully can be fixed with, DLC. Damn you, Bethesda! While Fallout New Vegas blew this game off the face of the planet with the Tsar Bomba, Fallout 3 is still a top bloody game and is more than worth your time. And you better have a lot of time for this next game. This game here got me into fantasy. Dragon Age Origins was recommended to me by the same friend who recommended me Oblivion. He told me about this game first though, and I'm glad he did, because this game is in many respects a lot better than Oblivion, or at the very least a lot less janky. Now, back in 2010 when I was first introduced to this game, I was dubious about fantasy. I just called it ignorant sci-fi. But I asked for this game for the Great Christ Mass, and the day came, and I spent one day and one night downloading the bloody bastard because, well, slow internet in those days, and it was 12 gigs! Oh my god! What we got here is a real-time RPG where you take the role of a Grey Warden as you fight the evil archdemon. Finally, we had some non-lame-ass fantasy, we had great factions, fun gameplay that, while more complex than Mass Effect's, was still fairly straightforward enough. The game world was even larger than Mass Effect's, and now you could take 4 dudes with you instead of 3! The characters in this game were even better written than Mass Effect's in many respects, and almost approaching KOTOR 2's. One thing I've always loved about RPGs is how you can have romance options. That's not something you're finding in an FPS, that's for sure. And this game gave me the best romance option of them all, a goth mage voiced by Claudia Black. So I played this game day and night. And one day I was chatting with that friend that recommended me the game, and I told him I needed to go study. And then I immediately jumped into Dragon Age, not knowing that Steam would pop up that I was in Dragon Age, and he would message me later laughing about how I wasn't really studying. For the longest time, it was my most played game in Steam, and it was time well spent.
With the improved technology of the early 2000s, the third-person shooter genre truly became viable. With the release of Grand Theft Auto 3, the third-person shooter open-world game shot up into the stratosphere in terms of popularity. By the end of the decade, the third-person shooter genre would be one of the most popular gaming genres of all time.
Kyle Katarn got his start way back in the genesis of the first-person shooter genre, and in less than a decade, we went from 2D and 3D jank to early 2000s greatness. Jedi Outcast is the concluding installment in the Kyle Katarn trilogy, and is by far the best. It fully incorporates first-person shooting with third-person lightsaber combat, although once you get that sweet-ass lightsaber, you never go back. This game takes lightsaber dueling from awkward button mashing to something much more fluid and precise. You get access to 3 lightsaber styles, you got force powers that can be dynamically used during the dueling, we've got, again, huge ass levels. I cannot tell you how big these levels are back in the early 2000s compared to what we get today. We got an epic and compelling narrative that cements Kyle as one of the greatest protagonists of all time. The only real problem with Jedi Outcast is that it's too bloody hard in places, with some of those stormtroopers taking 1 or 2 lightsaber hits to bring down. I guess they've been juicing. Sometimes the student can surpass the master. Released a short time later, Jedi Academy cements itself as one of the greatest games of all time. Jedi Academy is a spin-off from the Kyle Katarn trilogy, and in this game you take the role of his Padawan. The devs went all out here, and they let you choose the species and the naughty bits of a new Star Wars character named Jaden Korr. This game improves upon every single solitary thing that was seen in Jedi Outcast. The lightsaber combat was more refined, and now you could slaughter stormtroopers with ease. The dueling was much more dynamic, the levels were even more impressive, and you got some awesome vehicle segments too. Not only that, but you can choose your mission order. Kyle Katarn is the greatest Jedi Master of all time, and he does a great job training the player, and is a nice laid-back middle-aged dude, and when you got some escort missions, he's the one doing the escorting, and he makes short work of all those stormtrooper bastards. The story is great, and the moral choice you gotta make in the game is pretty hard, as you have a little weasel as your best friend, and he tries to screw you over, and to stay on the light, you can't just boot him out of an airlock. This game, like the previous one, had great multiplayer, and I actually played this multiplayer with bots. And the bots were fun to fight against, and all throughout the summer of 2004, I played this game against bots, all the while listening to heavy metal music on the radio. Good times. Grand Theft Auto 3 took the world by storm, and I could have cared less, as I hated playing as the bad guy. But I was intrigued by the concept of a huge open world game like Grand Theft Auto. Thankfully, other devs saw them dollar signs and delivered on a game where you didn't have to play as a bastard. True Crime Streets of LA is a third-person open-world game where you play 80s-styled cop Nick Kang as he tries to fight the forces of evil in the dank disease cesspit of LA. This would be the first open-world game that I would ever play, and it really sucked me in with its great graphics, complex gameplay, and I mean really complex, even complex for today. Unlike in other open-world games, you are rewarded for being the good guy, run people over, and you lose points, aka shields. You need shields because these points are your XP, and when you deal with things non-violently and you get more shields, you're able to unlock better weapons and abilities. This game's passive moral choice system does not only affect how many points you earn, but it will also affect what ending you get. This is more of a brawler than a shooter. Oftentimes enemies will surrender once the guns start going off, so most of the time you have to do some punchy, and the controls for that are absolutely excellent. The actual shooting is kind of crap, but functional. In the end, this was a criminally slept-on game. There are some games that truly shake things up when they are released, and Star Wars Battlefront shook up the entire bloody gaming community with how amazing it was. Man, I remember those placards for this game in GameStop, and I was sad, because I had to wait, because I wanted to play Halo 2 and Doom 3 first. But holy crap, was it worth that wait. Star Wars Battlefront is a game where you control a Star Wars ground pounder, and you go into battle in either third or first person. This game is geared towards third-person combat, and half the time I forgot there was even a first-person option. This game was super bloody impressive. This followed on from the popularity of Battlefield 1942, but it fixed some of the issues that were in that game. Most notably, if you play this game single player, you don't have to wait for a spawn timer. Now, like with Battlefield 1942, you could fight on the ground or you could get in vehicles. All the maps were absolutely huge, and there were a huge number of bots, and these bots had pretty good AI. This was a game I sunk countless hours into, all the while listening to classic rock. This shook up the Battlefield style of games, and only Battlefront 2, the real version, was able to dethrone it as the best. Now, having played the greatness of True Crime Streets of LA, I wanted a new open-world third-person shooter, and Pandemic Studios and LucasArts delivered. I don't even need to say more after that. You know it's gonna be good. Mercenaries Playground of Destruction is a game where you choose from one of 3 soldiers of fortune, each with their own stats, although it really does boil down to just shooting bastards in the face. You are sent into war-torn North Korea. You have a mission to eliminate the members of the Deck of 52 and finally take down Rocket Man once and for all. This is an absolutely massive game, and there's gameplay to be found all over the place. You want to just pick a point and drive to it and shoot communists? You can do it! And if you decide to finally pay attention to the bloody plot, you got a bunch of different factions vying for control over North Korea, and you had to choose your missions carefully lest you piss off one of the factions. You got excellent third-person shooting gameplay, although, as we'll see in just a moment, it's a bit older third-person shooter gameplay, as this is still behind the back. In addition to shooting bastards in the face with your rifles, you can also jump into a tank and blow shit up. You can jump into an aircraft and blow shit up from the sky. Then you've got all the airstrikes you can call in, all the artillery strikes you can call in a helicopter with rocket pods. The gameplay was completely chaotic and extraordinarily fun. Sadly, this game would release the same day as one of the most influential third-person shooters of all time. That's right! Mercenaries dropped the same day, in North America, as Resident Evil 4. Resi 4 popularized the over-the-shoulder third-person shooter with laser sight aiming, and sold literally bazillions of copies and was released on every platform known to man. It was to third-person shooters what Doom was to first-person shooters. The controls for this game were bloody perfection, the combat was super bloody fun, and you had a bunch of cool weapons to choose from. Red 9 Best PCC of the year all years. The game also had a lot of charm to it. You got this pirate merchant where you buy and sell stuff, stranger. Leon S. Kennedy returns from Resident Evil 2, and it's really charming and pretty funny, and he's rocking a great anime look too. I picked this game up in 08 for the Nintendo GameCube, and back in those days, the cube was $20, and I wanted to give Resi the good college try, and I found myself completely sucked into this bloody game due to its fun-ass gameplay and pretty enjoyable story. This would be the first Resi game that I would ever complete, and is still my favorite to this very day. These days, we take the internet for granted, but back in the 2000s, it was still pretty new. I used it, yeah, but it was just a thing I occasionally went on. Well, one day I was browsing a Predator fan site and saw mention of this game, Predator Concrete Jungle. Needless to say, I hadn't heard of it. I promptly went to the game store, only to be told by the game shop dude that it was crap. I bought the game anyway, and found that it was one of the great Predator games of all time. It's basically Proto-Assassin's Creed. You are a Predator named Scarface, and you gotta take down the evil Borgia family. Yeah, definitely Proto-Assassin's Creed. You've got great, if a little janky, third-person hack-and-slash gameplay. You got a lot of fun enemies to fight, tough boss fights, and a very memorable story that gets a little creepy in places, and all of this combines to give you the ultimate Predator experience. Ah man, Battlefront 2 is one of my top 5 games of all time. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was super bloody excited when Battlefront 2 dropped. I of course had it pre-ordered, and I was abuzz with anticipation when me mom and I went over to the game store to pick it up. Upon getting home, I threw it into the Xbox, and I haven't stopped playing it since. No, really, I still jump into it whenever I just want to blast some tinnies. This game improved upon everything in Battlefront 1, although it did remove going prone, but whatever. You got bigger and better maps, you got space maps, a reward system where the better you played, the more upgrades you could get, and if you played really, really good consistently, you could keep them permanently. We got an awesome story campaign narrated by Tamora Morrison himself, and the bots are even more fun to fight. And man, I spent many an hour playing Capture the Flag with bots so I could level up my blaster rifle to 3-round burst. This game sold like 11 billion copies and was released on everything, and I have it on everything. I played it on the Xbox first, and then the PSP. Now, the PSP version has some bittersweetness to it. One Thanksgiving, my grandfather had a heart attack, and he went into the hospital for weeks. And due to this, me mom gave me my PSP early, and Battlefront 2 on PSP really helped during those stressful days. Now, my grandfather, of course, survived that heart attack and lived to the ripe old age of 83, only passing in 2023. This is a game I introduced to a girl I was dating back around 2019, and she had actually played the crappy EA version, and I couldn't help but smile as she said that the true version of Battlefront 2 was way better. So remember, gentlemen, the quickest way to a girl's heart is with Battlefront 2. This is another one of those games that I consider adult. Not the content, but the fact that I was 18 when I finally played it. I went to my local game shop and I found it randomly. The cover looked cool, so I snapped it up. I played it a little bit, got bored, but by around 2010, I finally gave it its due. And man, what I found was super bloody impressive. Ass Creed is a third-person hack-and-slash game where you play as Altair as he tries to assassinate various political leaders, creating trouble in the Holy Land. You have awesome weapons such as the iconic Hidden Blade. Altair has a great hero's journey, and the world is massive, like more massive than anything I'd seen at that point, and extraordinarily graphically impressive too. This is where graphics were going from 2000-ish, mostly photorealism, to 2010's very photorealism. This game keeps the focus on assassinating, and your missions are all in service to assassinating those targets. You don't spend time doing tower defense or other such frivolities. This was when gaming was starting to get darker, but this game still had a lot of light to it. And this was a major turning point for gaming, and everything looked like it was just going to get better and better. In 2008, I was working at a shitty grocery store job, as you do, and one of my coworkers told me about a little game called Dead Space. He talked it up pretty good, and I picked it up and loved it then and love it now. It was an evolution of the gameplay seen in Resi 4. The third-person shooting was more fluid and fast-paced, the levels dark and creepy, and we got the super awesome rig armor that would become one of the most iconic aspects of this series. Since this game was from 2008, the gameplay was refined and complex with no greed jank as we'd see in later games in this series. And what you saw was what you got. Sadly, what we got was the beginning of the end for gaming, as this was the start of the bro era of gaming. This game story really is just pure bro era. No logic and really dumb decisions by the writing staff didn't stop me from reading all them text logs on a non-HD TV nonetheless. Suck it, eyesight! Well, a good game, it was the harbinger of things to come. This is the end, my friends. The end. By the end of the decade, many of the great gaming companies of the 2000s were dead, or at least dying. While their games were great, and while they sold a lot, that didn't save many of them from being bought out by the great demon EA, or just crashing and burning. One such legend was Pandemic Studios. This was their last game, and one of their very best. Damn you, EA! You blew it up! You bastards! Damn you all to hell! This game is set in a diesel-punk World War II France, and you play as Irish troublemaker named Sean. His mission is to take down the Germans to avenge a fallen comrade. This is one of the most impressive of the open-world games. You got a bunch of awesome guns, a huge world to explore with multiple cities that are very, very iconic. A disguise system that actually works, and an awesome mechanic where after you liberate a city block, it changes from black and white to color. Saboteur really sent the 2000s out with a bloody bang.
History is on the move. Those who can't keep up will be left behind, and those who stand in our way will not be there to watch it all. The real-time strategy genre really came into its own in the early 2000s. In the 90s, many developers were trying to figure out what a real-time strategy game was even supposed to be, and thus the 90s RTSs had a lot of clunky mechanics. By the early 2000s, a lot of those clunky mechanics were done away with, and the games were much more player-friendly. Multiplayer became a big part of the real-time strategy genre, and many of these multiplayer RTSs are played even today. This was truly a time to get your micromanaging skills on.
I was at a local Walmart when I first saw this game. I begged my grandparents to get it for me, and thanks to a timely series of good grades, I got to have it! AVP Extinction is a console RTS where you control either the aliens, the predators, or the Colonial Marine Corps. It's a small unit objective-based RTS with no multiplayer. All you do in this game is complete missions to progress through a story. How you generate resources are dependent upon your faction. The Colonial Marines need space bucks, and they generate them by building Atmo processors. The Predators need order, and they get that by collecting skulls. The aliens use conscription. They send out a recruiter to humans and predators, and presto, they get a new unit. The unit cap is also pretty low, but the game makes up for it by giving units decently high health. The controls are remarkably good, and while not as flexible as a mouse and keyboard, the PS2 or Xbox gamepad does allow you pretty decent control over your units, and I found this game to be a pretty good introduction to the RTS genre. This game also has some great lore that really expands upon the AVP universe. And speaking of lore, we got Dawn of War! The year was 2007, and I was entering my first year of college, and I bought myself a new Gateway laptop, and the first two games I bought for it were Dawn of War and Star Wars Empire at War. I had already been a 40k fan for years, and I really wanted to get stuck into a 40k RTS, and to finally control the armies I'd read so much about. Dawn of War is a base build RTS where you take and hold control points to generate money, you build up your armies, and use combined arms warfare to take down your foes. We got all the 40k factions, and each are mostly balanced and are really fun to fight against. The AI is pure cheese, and actually defeating it is super bloody hard. The plotline for the game and its expansions got a bunch of nubs into 40k and is equal parts awesome and hilarious. Star Wars could do no bloody wrong in the early 2000s, and by the time of Empire at War, there had been numerous Star Wars RTSs, and pretty much all had been kick-ass, with EOW being the best of them all. We had two types of maps, space and ground, and while ground combat was good enough, everybody loved playing space. Sadly, in unmodded Empire at War, you only had two and then later three total factions. You had the Empire, the Rebs, and the Zon Consortium, aka Space Pirates. Sadly, I don't know why they didn't include the CIS and Republic. There are of course mods that will add those factions into the game. You generated money by capturing asteroids, and we had massive unit counts. The multiplayer was and still is super bloody fun, and back in the 2010s, I played it with friends until 3 AM almost every bloody day. In addition to skirmishes, you also have Galactic Conquest, and I spent many an hour playing that. The computer was a cheating bastard, as a Super Star Destroyer could be destroyed by a bloody Barlaz freighter if you chose to auto-decide during Galactic Conquest. The story for the game was great and added a few new elements to the Star Wars EU. Oh, this game, Sins of a Solar Empire, was introduced to me by a best friend in 2010, and in addition to Empire at War, we played the hell out of this game. Sins of a Solar Empire is an R4X game, aka a massive RTS where you had to capture and develop planets, build fleets, research upgrades, and try and defeat the other guy. In this game, you had three factions, the TEC, the Asari, and the Vasari, and each have their own thing that gives them an edge. I cannot tell you how many hours I played this game, both co-op and PvP. Sadly, there was no story outside of the opening cutscene, but well, this is primarily a multiplayer-focused RTS, and I'm glad the devs focused on what mattered.
This was a time when gaming wasn't just confined to set genres. Instead, developers had the freedom and the technology to push the boundaries of what a game even was.
This game here was a low-budget release that I had when I was using me mum's rather limited desktop PC. Pearl Harbor Zero Hour is a top-down arcade-style flying game where you take control of classic World War II aircraft as you fight the Empire of Japan. Controls and gameplay are easy to pick up and play and are super addicting. You gotta dogfight fighters and dive bomb ships. You also have to dodge AA and attack ground targets. You have to play well to earn points to get better planes, and each mission will give you a major challenge. The devs in the README said they loved flight sims but wanted more action, so they made this game for the player that just wanted to get in and splash a few flat tops. This was a cheapo game that anyone could run, and it runs rings around most games today. Man, you had to be there back in the day. The Wii conquered all. It had motion controls that actually worked and was a console that everyone and their grandmother could play, and it sold bazillions and gave many families something to play together. Wii Sports Resort was a game that me and my family played the crap out of back in 2009 and then later 2022. It featured a bunch of mini games that range from god tier like bowling to kinda jank like waveboarding. It's a game that is easy to pick up and play, and many of the motions actually corresponded to somewhat real life. Me and my family played Wii bowling for hours and hours every Friday night back in the 2000s, and many a happy memory was made. In 2006, I was on a marching band field trip, and one of my friends introduced me to a little game called Guitar Hero. He's got stars in his eyes. He called it DDR, but like with your hands, man. And at the time, I loved me some classic and early 2000s rock, and so this was practically a miracle from the machine god given form. What you did was you pressed a button on either a plastic guitar or a controller in time with the colored icons on the screen. And it was kind of like playing music. Yeah, it's not that real close to a real guitar, but back then no one bloody well cared. We had so much fun playing the likes of Smoke on the Water and Cavemen Rejoice. This first game had all the charm of the 2000s with great menus that reveled in classic rock culture. It had an amazing set list that ranged from easy songs like I Love Rock and Roll to Bark at the Moon. Everyone back in the day loved this game, and I remember playing YYZ, which shows up in Guitar Hero 2, during my prom, and instead of being mocked for it, people fucking loved it back then. At last, we come to our final game. Mortal Kombat had been going strong for a long time, and in the early 2000s, they leveled up their game by introducing cool stories, varied and complex gameplay that incorporated fighting into a pseudo-RPG kind of thing, and it all culminated in Mortal Kombat Armageddon. You had all the fighters from across the franchise. You also had a kart racing game, but the greatest thing that Mortal Kombat Armageddon brought to the table was create a fighter. I would spend hours and hours making my own dudes, from the Terminator to a character totally not based on me, bro. The actual fighting was pretty fluid, with lots of awesome moves, and you could even bring out a weapon for more fun. No matter the bloody genre, the 2000s was truly a golden age of gaming.
You know, when this video goes up, I'm going to be 36 years old. And in that 36 years, I have lived through many gaming eras. Now, I chose the 2000s as my chosen era of gaming, not because of nostalgia or because I want to lament my lost youth. Instead, I chose it by really looking at what made gaming great. The 2000s had all the elements to make the best games. You had the talent and you had the tech. And games at that time were made for everyone who played games and not for slacktivists complaining about whatever. Hopefully, with this video, all of you will see what good games look like, and hopefully all of us can remember what gaming is supposed to be and not what it is today in this terrible flop era. Hopefully the next decade will see a rise of gaming yet again. It may be a pipe dream, but even if it is, we still got the greats of yesteryear. And so, I am General Lotz, wishing you good enemy territory Quake Wars, and good Battlefront 2, or whatever makes you happy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and please consider leaving a like or a comment, as the algorithm desires your soul. And I want to thank all those fans who have supported this channel, both past and present.